Alright, I was about to say, let's see if we can't burn some bridges, but that was the opening of the last video. It still kind of works here, I guess. Let's see if we can't dogshit tentpole content. I'm gonna rank all of the Star Wars movies, all of the live action, theatrical Star Wars movies, because like the streaming shows and stuff are just not even worth talking about. Alright, let's start at the bottom here. The young Han Solo movie. It's a really fun space western. Just kidding, it's dog shit. Have you even seen a western? There you go. I just introduced you to an opinion that you probably weren't even aware of, just so I could epically defeat it. And I tell you what, I won't record a different intro, so I will have to use that. It's just a nothing movie. It's a generic blockbuster mixed with a Wikipedia checklist. There were a couple of moments where I thought that Emilia Clarke's character was kind of interesting. There was like half a scene of worthwhile character stuff, and the performances are good. I think everyone does a good job. But beyond that, it's aimless and predictable. It looks like shit. It's messy and piecemeal. There's no overarching point or vibe or tone. It's so surface level, so shallow, and incredibly overlong for what it is. And just going, oh, remember things, isn't enough. That's nothing. But there's not too much actually wrong with it. I think, you know, the execution is as good as it could be, I guess. If you had to write a scene where Han Solo gets the legal last name of Solo because he was on his own, you know, it's done about as good as it could be. It's just a stupid, terrible idea. I would highly recommend it if you're easily impressed by some movement happening on a screen. Otherwise, there's a lot of competency on display here and nothing interesting. The Phantom Menace. There's almost no competency on display here, but a lot of interesting ideas. Ideas like racism and grooming and boy slavery. I maybe have more trust in George Lucas than most people. I think that these are not things that are being endorsed through the story. I think this is a story of an empire in decline, of the Jedi in decline, but it's still just the way that it's done is so uncomfortable and inscrutable. It is a bad movie, but not in the normal sense. There's like, I don't know, I feel like there's nothing like this. It's failed because it's so fucking weird. It maybe has some of the dumbest, worst recontextualizing of Star Wars out of any of these movies. Maybe that's a little harsh, but you know, there's stuff like the way that the Jedi are sort of reframed. Anakin invents C-3PO. It's just a barrage of like crazy, stupid ideas. And that is what this movie is, right? It's a collection of these little nuggets with like barely anything joining them together. Lots of little specific ideas and then just gaping holes in the plot. Completely disconnected storytelling. It's just aimlessly wandering about for 2 hours with thinnest connective tissue. You don't care about any of the characters. They're all kind of like unmotivated characters. And then that really becomes a problem when you have these overlong action sequences. You don't have a reason to care about it. So it's probably fine if you like action for the sake of it, if you're just inherently interested in the pod race, but I'm not. I don't like that, so it doesn't work for me. Kind of a disaster of a movie, but it's endlessly interesting to me because of how much of a mess it is. The Last Jedi. I know this is a controversial take. Feel free to just skip this one if this is going to annoy you. I'm not trying to be controversial. I just struggle to like this movie because it's a piece of shit, and so is everyone who likes it. No. The biggest problem with this movie for me is there's a lot of very broad jokes, not my sense of humor at all. I remember being in that theater opening night, not laughing at all. A lot of the jokes were actually going to nothing in a packed opening night theater. There's maybe a New Zealand cultural difference there, but still, it's not a great sign. I just very strongly remember the strong sense of dread that this was the movie. I can't handle it. I can handle cringe, as this ranking will reveal, but that sort of broad American humor, especially when it's not actually working, that fucking sucks. So, this is the most unwatchable to me. and that is the reason why. Now, the craft of it is really good. It's a really slick, sort of current blockbuster aesthetic. It doesn't really do the trappings of Star Wars, but it has its own style, trying to define a new sort of style, and that's cool. But it's long and clunky. It's sort of structurally a lot like the Phantom Menace, very meandering, a lot of like these key moments that you can tell they wanted to get to, but like nothing connecting them, with the plots not really informing each other, and most of the plotting happening on account of characters not communicating effectively, which is also incredibly annoying to me. I can't stand that in a movie. Anyway, there's a lot that I conceptually like here. I prefer Star Wars stories that play at the edges of Star Wars. I'm not looking for retreads or remember things. This is sort of a subversion of The Force Awakens and tries to like twist Star Wars around and forge a new path. It does sort of dig up all the moments and tropes that you'd expect, but it just does the opposite of them. It's doing deconstruction, it's doing rejection, it feels like a creative vision. And I'm going, yes, fuck yes! And then it doesn't really do that. It doesn't use that to stick a landing. It never goes further than just digging up stuff you remember and doing the opposite of it. And ultimately it's very safe, and it does all the sort of Disney-approved plotting. It doesn't go in a new, interesting direction. It sort of resets itself. Luke looks out over the twin suns, which was him looking to the future, remember? But now it's just the past. It's just the past forever. I was hoping to just sidestep any culture war talk here, but I think I have to address it. So let's do an extra minute and a half here of culture war stuff. None of my dislike of anything in this movie is due to racist incel reasons. I don't think it's a particularly progressive movie. It is quite an on-the-nose allegory for American political developments of early 2016, but I don't think it has anything to say, or the messaging is just so milquetoast and specific that it's of no value. This is a movie about the left needing to fall in line and accept the authority of the wise liberals. More specifically, it's about women in leadership, which is hampered by the fact that the women in this movie are sort of sexistly characterized as bad leaders. And more broadly, it just sort of calls for civility and depolarization, liberal consensus. Given that the main result of this movie has been bickering online, I don't know that it's achieved that. It's just sort of some centrist shit, and that's fine, that's most movies, but to take this weird, alienating movie that doesn't really stand for anything, and then market it and defend it as being something more than that, hasn't led to a mass liberal consensus. It's been a huge win for internet bigots, and it's a culture war template that we've seen repeated ever since. So I think it's just a bit of a messy movie. It's quite grating to me because of comedy reasons. It's sort of hollow, and its political legacy has been a disaster. Rogue One. This is a pretty stupid idea for a piece of Star Wars content. It's like one of the most told Star Wars stories ever. Before the Disney acquisition, it was like every single character in Star Wars had touched the Death Star plans at one point. Everyone wants to tell the story of how the Death Star plans got stolen, and this is just not the most incredible telling. I think there's a conceptually interesting perspective, conceptually interesting characters, sort of the expendable underclass of the Star Wars story. It's a perspective that we don't normally see. That's not bad. And I think the sort of introductions to these characters, at least Jyn and Cassian, I think have pretty strong introductions. But then there's just nothing else here. The characters get introduced, there's a long stretch of nothing much happening, then they die, and there's just a arse ton of fan service sprinkled in. I think it just has nice little ideas sometimes couched within this larger lack of an idea. This is Star Wars made by Star Wars fans trying to replicate Star Wars, and unsurprisingly, it doesn't really do anything interesting or new. And this is sort of a further closing down of the Star Wars story world. There's endless possibilities here, right? There aren't really any rules to this universe. You could do whatever you want, and this is just like reducing the scope of everything. It really does look great sometimes, especially earlier. There's some quite tasteful visual effects work. The way that they are shooting like the Star Destroyers looks really good, sort of more reminiscent of like space photography than Star Wars, they also do some stuff where they try and sort of replicate the look of the model shots from the original trilogy. And I really like that stuff aesthetically. On its own, that's not really enough. It doesn't really carry the movie to have some nice shots. And then as the movie goes on, it kind of goes to shit. At the very end of the movie, where Princess Leia turns around and says, "Hope," there was actual laughter in my theater. And I think just generally, this is a massive visual effects production, and the quality of that stuff is all over the place. So I guess a lot of highs and lows even with the aesthetic. And as the movie goes on, just everything becomes more loaded with nostalgia and more of a mess, and just by the end, you know, I'm completely checked out. Attack of the Clones. Now this is interesting. You probably have an idea of my thoughts on this, but I've never sort of specifically actually expressed them. It's a movie plagued by micro issues, but it's my feeling that beyond that, there's something kind of okay here. Obviously, it continues off from the Phantom Menace, introducing all sorts of weird, idiosyncratic ideas, really an obtuse movie, an alienating movie, which I quite like. It's not pandering, it's expanding the story well. I like the sort of introduction of and focus on the war, the undermining of the Jedi, the fall of the Republic stuff coming together. It's a shambles, but it does work to kind of reframe Star Wars and maybe get you thinking a bit. Maybe. I actually quite like the Obi-Wan stuff on the whole. It's probably one of the best paced plot lines of the prequels. Once it starts crossing over with the other plot lines, it's not very tidy, but that on its own is pretty good. Being a collection of George Lucas's weird ideas, it does actually flow together, which is something. I like the idea of having a more Shakespearean romance in Star Wars. Obviously the delivery of it is dog shit, but I conceptually am interested by that. It probably has even more little nitpick problems than the Phantom Menace, but for me, on a broader level, a lot more is kind of working here. There are big fundamental problems: Anakin's characterization, the dialogue, generally bad visual quality, and bloated action set pieces. Rather than watching and going, "Oh, this sucks," I'm like going, "Oh, that pause was a little too long," or whatever. Feels like you can see a better movie in here. Not a great one, but slightly better. That's maybe not a good thing, but I find it entertaining. The Force Awakens. Did you know this movie actually repeats a lot of the plot beats of A New Hope? Obviously this is corporate slop, but in my opinion it's corporate slop done to perfection. I probably wouldn't even put it in the same category as the other episodes. It's quite different. It's a product, but it's just a really good one, I think. I quite like the J.J. Abrams direction here. He obviously pulls a lot of cheap tricks to make his movies seem better than they are, which I love. That's like magic to me. Reusing imagery, over-exaggerating the stakes, the timing, the consequences, excessive coincidence, the shaking the camera, the flares, the color, quippy characters, all the exposition is shouted while running. There's a lot of blood and sweat and tears, cheap callbacks, unearned emotions, mystery boxes, all hacky dog shit, right? But just pulled off excellent. It doesn't add anything to the Star Wars story, the Star Wars world. It's actually incredibly sort of reductive in terms of that, but it does introduce these fun, lovable characters that you care about. But I think this is what it had to be: a reboot, a reminder. Hey, look, we can do all the aesthetic trappings of Star Wars. You're in safe hands. Let us make some more franchise movies. And I think it quite mechanically sort of checks all the boxes that it needed to check. But it's just a fun blockbuster. Strong emotional moments, often unearned, perfectly mechanically balanced in terms of its tone and its flow. The editing is so sharp and lean, and the story is really tight. Absolutely color by numbers, but it just feels like everything is working here for this story. Everything clashes together, the plot threads inform each other, weaves together beautifully, in contrast to all the rest of Disney Star Wars that's happened since, where they have sort of tried to mechanically do a blockbuster. This does that, it achieves that, but I think it has a sort of heart to it, it has a good feeling to it. But obviously it's meaningless, it goes nowhere, you look at it in too much detail and it all falls apart. The fan service is goofy and irritating, the way it restricts the Star Wars story is also just like such a waste. It doesn't really do much at all, but it's just a really well done standalone product. Revenge of the Sith. This is still not great, which might come as a shock to some. I spent a controversial amount of time defending this movie. Basically, I just said all that stuff for a laugh. This is the prequels taken to their logical extreme. It's the prequels executed the best that they were executed, taking a lot of those ideas and threads from the first two and landing a lot more of them. And also introducing a lot of new ideas and not landing those. Still quite weird, quite inaccessible, quite alienating, but competent enough that it works. This ridiculous operatic style is sort of a crazy gamble. It's not something you really see, but I think it kind of works. It's interesting, it's different, and that's cool. It's not a very literal movie, which I quite like. Missing the mark on a lot of things. It's not paced incredibly, especially the later action set pieces in this movie are incredibly bloated, and it still feels just a little bit misdirected. It just needs like a little bit more reshaping. Just come on, just a couple more drafts. But I just think, you know, a lot more of it is sort of brought over the line. Like the other prequels, I think it's unique and interesting. It's interesting on a meta level. It's not like a movie that you normally see, and that's cool. But as well as that, it is sort of actually achieving a lot more of what it's setting out to achieve, I think. Return of the Jedi. This is a pretty daft and plotty movie. It kind of feels like the first time that the blockbuster was formularized. You know, they're plugging in the pieces where they go. It sort of like locks down the Star Wars formula. And there's only so good that that can be. The scope of it is so large, big budget experience. There are like some incredible compositing feats. It's really incredible. They had like, you know, 60 layers of motion controlled film all composited into the same frame. But I don't know, it kind of loses something, I think. It gets a bit bloated. It doesn't really do anything for me. It goes for the intercutting that Empire Strikes Back did so brilliantly. The back half of this movie, they're cutting between like Luke's confrontation with the Emperor and his father, and like the space battle with Lando and Han and Leia standing in front of the door. And it's sort of like none of those moments are really matching or informing each other. That intercutting works best when there is some sort of interplay between the different plot threads, and this just feels like, you know, it's just intercutting for pace, I guess, and that's fine. It works to keep the pace up, but it never really like clicks. As a kid, this was probably my favorite one. Great to see the good guys win, but I guess still I feel like Star Wars being this very sort of broad fairy tale, morality fable sort of story, it is important the good guys win, and that's the end of the story. It'd be stupid to try and do anything after that, but it's just sort of a serviceable wrap-up, which I like. You know, Star Wars has this fairy tale quality, the mythic quality, and I really like that, and, you know, having a sort of silly fairy tale ending is part of that. Also sloppy is the incest stuff. Now, let's talk some good movies. A New Hope. Yeah, this is movie magic. It's the inspiring, creative work, vision, execution. It rocks. On some level, it's one of my favorite movies ever. Of course, I should note, there's a lot of the prequels in here, a lot of iffy dialogue, weird plotting and pacing, but I wouldn't change a thing. It's just a beautiful whole piece. It's just a really, it's a cool movie. It's just like the craft of this is amazing, the technical execution of it. There's a lot of stuff in here that, like, Star Wars has never been able to top aesthetically. Beautiful models, this lived-in world, very simple coverage, not a lot of clutter. It's a very sort of minimal movie, and it has its own sort of style to it, which I guess is all kind of limitation driven, but it's great. Just the concepts here and the delivery of them is really clear and unique. It's not something that you really see. You know, it's not a hard sci-fi, a hard story world. It's not like got any rules or anything, but there's just so many little pockets of detail and imagination. I really recommend watching 4K 77, which is the original theatrical film. It's been scanned and restored. I should note, as a kid, my first Star Wars movie was Empire Strikes Back. I didn't see any of the prequels in theaters. I saved up and I bought this DVD release of the original trilogy. Unbeknown to me at the time, this was the only time that the actual original theatrical film was released on home video. So my childhood experience with Star Wars was actually mostly watching the theatrical cuts of the original trilogy, like a precocious tit. And I'd have to spend more time thinking about the prequels than watching them because I didn't own them. So I think that explains my entire Star Wars content. It probably explains why my ranking here is the same as your dad's, because I had, in essence, the same childhood experience with Star Wars as your dad. Anyway, Star Wars, beautifully balanced, small story within an implied larger world. It never works in specifics, which I think works really well. It has its own style, and it is just sort of creatively inspiring, I think. Oh, Empire Strikes Back is the best Star Wars movie. How'd you come up with that take, genius? I love this. It feels like the perfect blend of Star Wars and competency without being overly commercial. You know, every scene, and I can't say this for the rest of these movies, but every scene here stands on its own, as well as being necessary and tight. Just a cohesive movie. Everything informs each other, with the plot being all character driven. You know, everything in this movie is character first. All the locations are reflective of where the characters are. The pace is reflective of the characters. Everything is built around character without really much regard for anything else. And that rocks. And the way people communicate in this movie, the dialogue here is really great, really sort of stylized, maybe old Hollywoodish, sort of, you know, perfectly little crafted exchanges, as well as having a lot of just quite authentic dialogue that's just sort of, you know, off the cuff little moments and things. The characters are often not communicating at face value. In fact, probably all of the characters are never communicating at face value. You understand them all, and they understand each other, but it's sort of, it deals almost entirely in subtext. It's often quite funny, and that's always character first. The like comedy of this movie comes from characters just acting authentically. It never does a joke, but it's just because it builds out these characters so you know and you understand these characters when they sort of are communicating at cross purposes or whatever. There was just an inherent comedy there. The characters are just sort of constantly exposing themselves and trying to cover for themselves. And that is the best that dialogue could ever be. It just doesn't try to up the stakes or the scale for the sake of it. It's just very personal, and everything that happens is in service of that personal story, and I think it actually feels bigger because of that. There is the continued implication that there is a larger world beyond this story. Never needs to explore that, which is a feat that was never accomplished again. It has real style, I suppose quite derivative in terms of its style, but it has style. I think it sort of takes what worked in A New Hope and then adds sort of more dynamic lighting and color and camera movement. The coverage of A New Hope was quite flat, and this is sort of shot in a way, I suppose, is just more reminiscent of a smaller movie, which absolutely works. It maybe breaks out of what the Star Wars style is a little bit, especially of those first 6. This is the outlier in terms of its style, but it just looks slick as fuck. And a lot of smoke. Just inexplicably, every location in the movie is smoky. I think it's just the perfect approach to the subject material. It uses this story world to tell intimate but big story, right? Big emotions, big narrative, big locations, big character, big score. It's just sort of ludicrously heightened, and that rocks. But there we go. That's all of the live-action Star Wars movies ranked. Yep, that's all of them. I just watched Andor and I was pretty impressed, so I will record my thoughts on that and put that up on the website. I also did a big collection of Star Wars takes up on the website last week to figure out what I was doing for this video. Anyway, I'm working on some actually good content and I will probably be back for more dog shit tentpole content in a fortnight. So I'll see you then.